Hello, everybody. This is Amy Peikoff, and you're joining me for my second news sandwich. News Sandwich is the show where I'm trying to make news more palatable for you by taking that bad news that we have to know about, that we don't want to evade, and sandwiching it in between a couple layers of good news. And I think you're going to like what I have today because not only is it my pet topic of privacy, but even the bad news today has a good angle to it. Now, of course, you could argue that the good news also has some not great angles to it, or at least one of the pieces does. So we'll get into it and see what you think. I'm going to go over here to YouTube and make sure that everything looks like it's good before I dive in. Let me see how we're doing. I'm showing up as far as I can tell. Okay, so hello, everybody. So what we're going to start with is a constitutional amendment. I want to thank listener Josh for sending this information to me. He's involved in New Hampshire politics. He lives up there. And apparently what New Hampshire is doing is they're putting a constitutional amendment on the ballot for November having to do with privacy. There are other states, including California, that have done this, but I think New Hampshire's is particularly interesting. I don't know if it's going to actually succeed, if it's going to get enough votes, but I think there's one specific aspect to it that is quite good. So let me read it to you. It's going to be Article 2B of the Constitution. It's titled Right to Privacy. I'll talk about that in a second, but here's the text. It says, an individual's right to live free from governmental intrusion in private or personal information is natural, essential, and inherent. So again, it says an individual's right to live free from governmental intrusion in private or personal information is natural, essential, and inherent. The good thing I think about this is that it specifically calls out governmental intrusion into your private affairs. I think that's beautiful because, as you've seen probably, and as I see the California Constitution being construed and the California legislation that's coming down and everything, and the GDPR, the predominant focus is always on what companies are doing. Big evil corporations trying to get your data and make money off it and all that. That has been the focus. And here we have a constitutional amendment that is focusing specifically on governmental intrusion. Something else that I really like about it, I've got only one page. This is the one page write-up that I guess is going to appear in the ballot information that's mailed to everybody in New Hampshire. Maybe it's already been mailed. There's no website up yet. It actually refers to a website at the bottom of this page, but when you go there, the link isn't live or anything. But an interesting thing about this write-up is it echoes, by coincidence, some of the criticisms that I've had of the current constitutional jurisprudence on privacy. So, for example, people who have followed me for a very long time know that I have talked about the 1967 Katz case, the Supreme Court case that instituted a test for whether your privacy was invaded inappropriately by government under the Fourth Amendment. And the way that they gloss this is whether a search has been conducted for purposes of the Fourth Amendment. If there's a search, you have to have a warrant based on probable cause and particularized suspicion. And what the Katz court ended up in a concurrence establishing as the test is whether you have a reasonable expectation of privacy in a particular piece of information. And that includes two prongs. Traditionally, that's what they ask. They say, do you actually expect privacy? And if you do actually expect privacy, is that expectation one that society is prepared to recognize as reasonable? So do you have the expectation? And does society accept your expectation as reasonable? That's been the test. And a big complaint about this, of course, is that it is just left up to the desires, in effect, of society. And not just the desires of society, as if you take some public opinion poll, but it's as construed by a judge, whatever he happens to think that day. So it's rather subjective. And people who heard me talk about the Carpenter case that was decided in June, on what principle can you decide whether cell phone location data is something in which you have a reasonable expectation of privacy, but other types of data that are collected by third parties are not. There's a lot left up in the air. And so the nice thing about this write-up is it identifies this problem with the CATS test. It says here, the problem with CATS is that courts and ordinary people don't think the same things are reasonable, right? So what the authors of this amendment are recognizing, at least, is that privacy is a value judgment. It constitutes a value judgment. And in my own work on privacy, when I've published law review articles and stuff, I will say that a right to privacy is inherently non-objective as law. Why? Because the label private is a value judgment. It's something that each of us decides. There's some things that I think are too private to share with other people that other people are happy to share all day long on, Instagram or Facebook or whatever. And what I, think that is evidence of, it's just one piece of evidence, but it's evidence of the fact that a right to privacy is not primary. It is not a fundamental right. And what it actually depends on is your choice to exercise your rights to property and contract, to protect your privacy, to create states of privacy for yourself. And so what I like here is that at least the authors of this constitutional amendment, this proposed constitutional amendment in New Hampshire, what they're recognizing is the subjective nature of this so-called right to privacy as it's construed. What's unfortunate is what I talked about at the beginning, that they are calling it right to privacy. They're saying, that there is. And so that they don't recognize, and I wouldn't expect them to. I mean, they haven't read my law review articles or my forthcoming book, which I have to write, right? So how would they know? But, if you actually put this in terms of a right to privacy, if you protect it that way, or you purport to protect it that way, it's going to be inherently subjective. And so it's no surprise that one of the big complaints about this proposed amendment to the Constitution is that the wording is vague. And so that you're not going to really know when your privacy is going to be protected as against the government. Is it going to be protected as against the state government, the federal government, all of these things? It just says you have a right to live free from governmental intrusion in private or personal information, and that is natural, essential, and inherent. I would say it's actually not inherent, that it comes from other rights, but the only way to be objective about this is to protect fully our rights to property and contract, and allow people to use our rights to property and contract to create states of privacy for themselves. So kudos to New Hampshire for at least identifying that government is really the biggest threatening intruder into our privacy, because Facebook wants to make money off of you, but Facebook doesn't have, they have a lot of information. We'll go into that in a little bit. But they don't have a bunch of different databases about you that, the president can just whip out his pen and phone and say, okay, combine all these databases into one huge mega database that tracks everything that you do 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The only entity that has the power to do that is government. Government, as usual, is the biggest potential rights violator to us. And New Hampshire is going a long way to recognizing that, which, kudos to them. It's good that they single out government. Why? Because the bad news this week is that there is going to be a governmental intrusion, a significant governmental intrusion into your private life. It's not coming in the sense yet, right, of them taking your data, collecting your data. It's a different type of intrusion into your privacy. It is that Donald Trump is going to potentially get the power to send a text message to your phone, to most all of the phones in United States, on the premise that it's necessary in case of an emergency for him to be able to do so. Some of you who follow me on social media have seen me post about this, that FEMA is going to test very soon its so-called presidential alert system, in which you would receive text messages from the president, who happens now to be Donald Trump, who likes to talk and make you listen to him. In an emergency, supposedly in an emergency, this is when you're going to get it. This is a huge intrusion. Obviously, not too many of us are very excited about a president able to invade your privacy by sending to your cell phone at any time of the day or night a text message. I'm not thrilled about it myself. It turns out the kind of good news angle of this is that plenty of Americans are not very happy about it either. And so the angle that I've got on this story for you today, NBC, I think, also put this out. They put out the original story as well. FEMA's presidential alert test has been postponed because some Americans want to disconnect. So it was going to be tomorrow, Thursday, but instead they've pushed it back to October 3rd. It turns out they've gotten a lot of blowback that people want to opt out. Joanne from New York, obviously, given her handle on Twitter, says, "We don't need presidential alerts. We already have public emergency alert messaging. This is not necessary." Lots of exclamation points in here. "We should be able to opt out of these messages." WTH, what the hell? What the hell would he have to say that local agencies can't? No, Joanne says. Stephen says, "A great example of why a bad president is so bad for the country. This POTUS is so bad that folks are prepared to forego the potential benefits of a national alert system, which already exists on radio and TV, because it's hard to believe Trump will not abuse it." So his fear is, look, we had a system that it was going to just be legitimate, but people will actually turn it off just to avoid having Trump in their phone, which I think is true. I would do it. Nancy, all of these are tweets. Nancy writes, "On September 20th, shortly after 2 p.m., a presidential alert will be sent to all cell phones in the US as a test. I don't trust Trump, so my phone will be shut off at 1 and left off the remainder of the day. Let the messages get backed up. 2 exclamation points. Go Dark 920. Spread the word. Retweet." So she's starting a whole movement. Then Dr. Dina Grayson, I guess, had a thread on this. The last one was, "Most importantly, how does one opt out? The last thing I need is a text message from real Donald Trump." You know, it's his handle on Twitter. And then we have the little vomit emoji from Dr. Dina Grayson. Emmanuel writes, "So then the emergency alert must come directly from FEMA and not from his phone. Otherwise, he's going to abuse it as a campaign tool for his own interest." End quote. So it seems that Emmanuel also has Donald Trump's number. It's nice that they've had to postpone it. It looks, though, that even though they're postponing it, it's not like they're going to get rid of it. So I don't know if it's great news. What I would say, you know, if we think about this in terms of Big Brother, right? This is exactly the thing that came to my mind. Big Brother from 1984. Here's real Donald Trump, his handle on Twitter. He's going to be able to send a text message directly to your phone. And yeah, I do think he's going to abuse it, and he's going to try to make himself look good and somehow sway the midterm elections and everything else. Notice the timing. It's just before the midterm elections. I would not be surprised if some sort of emergency is going to come up where he's going to grandstand and use this service to try to make himself look good, so that somehow the GOP is going to hang on to the House and the Senate or something. But if you think along those lines, right, that this is really what I called Bigly Brother. My friend Mike coined that, Bigly Brother instead of Big Brother. Bigly Brother 1.0, that this is just the first step toward having a continuous, constant connection between you and a central government. It's coming from them first to you, but you know, we'll see how long that lasts, right? When you think along those lines and you think about what does it mean that they're putting it off until October 3rd, they see that a bunch of people are upset. They hope that everybody's got a really short memory. And so that by October 3rd, somehow they'll forget, and that it can happen without people raising too much of a stink. But here I am reminding you about it. And I would say, please don't have the short attention span that most Americans have these days about violations to their rights, and keep this in mind. It doesn't seem like it is appropriate for a president to send text messages to you directly versus, say, local authorities that know whether you specifically are really in danger. And always you should be able to opt out of this stuff, unless somehow there is some danger that you pose if you're not aware of this and you don't take certain actions or something. Otherwise, you should be able to opt out of all alerts of this nature. And so, yeah, John over here on YouTube is saying, I'm calling my cell provider to see how I can opt out. Well, in terms of me opting out, what I am putting my faith in is the subject of the third story, the other good news story that I've got in our sandwich today. And it is Apple. I'm actually putting my faith, not really faith, but trust in Apple to give me a way to opt out of those messages. And so the headline that I've got for you, this is a Fast Company story. Forget the new iPhones. Apple's best product is now privacy. Those of you who watched last week, you know that I was talking up Apple and I was talking up the new iPhones to a certain extent, but mostly the watch. I'm excited about the watch, although I heard the watch face is going to be a little bit bigger, actually. So that's kind of sad. It's going to be another 2 millimeters, and I don't know if I've got space for 2 more millimeters there on that wrist, but I'm gonna test it out. I'm still excited about the features. But one thing I talked about last week was that Apple has also been a very good steward of our privacy, in addition to providing all kinds of other cool features for us. And the watch, I talked about the upcoming features of the watch. This Fast Company story is focusing completely on Apple as a steward for our privacy. And I mean, it's a really great article. I wasn't even aware of all the ways in which Apple has protected and is going to continue to protect and expand the protection for our privacy. So as I said, I'm going to look into it, but I bet you if any company is going to provide a feature on its phones that will allow you to opt out of pesky messages from Donald Trump, it's going to be Apple. Listen to this. And this is a tech expert, Michael, I can't remember his last name, from Fast Company. I'll go ahead and put the link at my blog at don'tletitgo.com so you can read the whole article. But he talks about how he's been recommending Apple products for years, and he talks about the industrial design and the great features and everything. And he says that, he says journalists, analysts, and armchair Apple pundits have taken to social media and said that the new Apple iPhones are the best Apple products ever. And he says, actually, he disagrees. He thinks the best Apple product is not any of the hardware specifically, but instead, he says, the best Apple product has, and the single biggest reason that consumers should choose an Apple device over competing devices is privacy. Okay. Now, the thing about his emphasis here is he goes on in the article to talk about all the features of Apple operating systems and products that protect you from the ills of what he calls the so-called commercial surveillance state. So his primary focus, unlike the New Hampshire constitutional amendment proposal, is the big evil corporation collecting your information and making money. I forget, he's got a phrase for this of what it is that, he talks about the data. Let me see what it is. What does he call it? What does he call it? Oh gosh, sorry. He's got a phrase to refer to this, this market for data. It's like black data or something like that. Anyway, I'll find it. In any event, his emphasis is on this. And he talks about, the perils of online privacy. He says it's been only in the last few years that the perils of online privacy have made their way to the forefront of national conversation, thanks to Cambridge Analytica and a lot of data breaches and hacks. And he doesn't mention in here at all the Snowden revelations, right? And the ways that the NSA, that the government is obtaining this. It's one thing for these companies, these commercial entities, to sweep up your data and keep it and use it to try to make money and advertise to you and stuff like that. But it's another thing entirely for it to go in the hands of government without, again, a warrant, no probable cause, no particularized suspicion. And then they just put it in some huge database and combine it with other databases. And then suddenly you're living in the Bentham panopticon that I've talked about in the past, where they're essentially surveilling you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because of the data being turned over to them. That's, to me, the real danger. But this focuses on the data that goes to commercial entities. It's still, not insignificant, because a lot of people would prefer to have their privacy protected. So what they talk about is an operating system. So for example, they say with each iteration of the iOS, the operating system that's on the portable devices, and also each iteration of the operating system on the laptops and the desktops, they are steadily making it harder for third parties to siphon data from us. They say, for example, the Safari browser was the first to block third-party cookies by default. Then Apple went a step further. They implemented something called intelligent tracking prevention. This reduces the ability of advertisers to track your movements around the web. The iOS 12, which comes on the new phones, but is also going to be available on all Apple phones, all the way down to the 5S, right? It's going to allow all of us Apple users to shield ourselves from Google and Facebook even more than we can now. And they also are having what they call anti-fingerprinting technology in Safari, because what it will do is it will hide specific characteristics about the device that you're using from those advertisers' tracking software. So in essence, Apple is doing a whole lot of things, is continuing to expand their ability for you to share less and less information with third parties automatically, simply because of the operating systems of the devices and also the characteristics of the hardware. And why is this so important? I was alluding to it before, but to make it more explicit, right now, the law of this country, the Katz that I was talking about, the Katz case that I was talking about with respect to the New Hampshire Constitution, the law of this country allows the government to obtain information that is shared with third parties without a warrant. It's not a search in the Fourth Amendment, according to the Fourth Amendment. If the government gets the information from Facebook, from Google, from any of these other companies without a warrant, it's not a search, it's not a violation of the Constitution. And so the less information that you can share with a third party, the better in terms of the protection of your privacy, unless or until the law actually protects our privacy properly. So we have Apple stepping up, making it possible for you to easily protect more of your information from these third parties. I'm sure Facebook's not very happy about this, but what the article goes in to talk about is they say that Apple's business model, that they have in effect the luxury of doing this because Apple's business model doesn't rely upon using the data. And again, this is what it is. It says user data is the new black gold. That's the way that the author of this Fast Company article puts it. And he says, Apple's business model doesn't rely on monetizing that information. And in fact, Apple has had a reputation going back to Steve Jobs of protecting our privacy. Steve Jobs used to talk about how he was very honored that the Apple customers entrusted their personal information with him, and he wanted to go ahead and do right by that trust that the customers put in him. And it sounds like Tim Cook has taken that aspect that is really good from Steve Jobs even farther. There might be some complaints that you and I might have about Tim Cook, maybe an environmentalist leaning and stuff like that, but he has been really solid on privacy. As I said, this article, the Fast Company article, is emphasizing more what Apple is doing to protect you as against the, companies, right? As commercial companies. But that does have implications for protecting your information as against government. And Apple is still doing all the things that it was doing before in terms of encryption. The author of this piece does make some concrete suggestions about how Apple could improve in this regard. And one thing that it could do, he's saying, is that in addition to end-to-end encryption for messages and passwords and things like that, which Apple already provides, he wonders whether you could have encryption for all the things that we store in the cloud. And that would give you great privacy because, again, everything that you share with a third party, and that means things that you put in the cloud with Apple that are not encrypted, those can be retrieved by the government without a warrant. That means no probable cause, particularized suspicion is required. It's just at the mercy of whatever the latest legislation is that's passed through Congress. There is not constitutional protection at this point for information that you share with third parties, except cell phone location data, okay? Because that was in Carpenter in June, but it was this very narrow ruling. So, what this author is suggesting is, what if we encrypt that? The danger, as he points out, is that if it's encrypted and if somebody happens to forget his or her password, then that data could be lost forever. And that's probably something that business-wise you wouldn't want to take the risk of. You could warn somebody all day long, but there's always the person who doesn't read the warnings adequately, who somehow loses or forgets the password and then would lose, who knows, years worth of treasured photographs and things like that. And you could see how that would be a big business risk. But he recommends, he says, having an option to enable end-to-end encryption on iCloud Drive would be nice for those of us willing to take the risk. The other thing that he recommends is that when you upload your contacts to the cloud for Apple, which many people do. Some people don't necessarily use the iCloud Drive for their files, but they'll upload contact information so that it's accessible on their, all their devices. What he's suggesting is that the fields, the information fields that are actually uploaded to the cloud, when you, share that data in the cloud, that it should be restricted, or you should at least be allowed to restrict it, because some people will put in the notes of that contact information stuff that's very private, and you would perhaps not like to have that up in the cloud, accessible perhaps to hackers. But again, you don't necessarily want government to be able to have access to it without a warrant, without probable cause, without particularized suspicion. So that would be a good improvement. And he says, in fact, he expects to see Apple do this sooner rather than later. When you store your contacts in the cloud, that it's going to be only the name and the contact information, and not the notes, for example, that would have more personal information. But kudos to Apple. As I said, Apple, I am counting on you to protect me from the text messages that are going to be coming my way from Donald Trump. Give me some way to opt out of it. Preferably, Apple, could you give me ways to opt out of that and still opt into any emergency messages from my local authorities? That would just be beautiful, because again, intrusions of your privacy are not just the government grabbing your data, but I would say Donald Trump text messaging you at any hour of the day. That is one of the worst intrusions ever. No, thank you. No, thank you. So that is your news sandwich, everybody. I'll take a look here at any questions or comments that I've got on YouTube. But otherwise, if you want to zoom out of here, because I promise you a half hour and we're right at the half hour, you are free to go. If you like my work, please subscribe here on YouTube, click like, share it with your friends. And I'd love to have you as a patron over at my Patreon page. So thanks, everybody. Let me take a look at the messages here. Steve Ditko, as he calls himself on YouTube, says, to protect your privacy, be cryptic. You could. Thank you, John, for tuning in. Mike says, about time someone looks out for the privacy of the customer. But that's the thing, Mike, Apple's been doing this forever. And actually, the thing that's cool about this article, so thanks to Fast Company, I was unaware of the extent to which they were doing it. And they're doing it in exactly the right way, because until the law protects us properly, anything that the companies can do to reduce the amount of information you share with them is beautiful. Because as I said, every time you share something with a third party, right now our constitutional law says that the government can access it without a warrant, and that is wrong. John says, I'm getting an iPhone for Christmas. Yeah, but any, so maybe you didn't have an iPhone before. Yeah, I highly recommend it. Not only are they beautiful and user-friendly, but now we have verification that they are the best stewards of your privacy, much better than the Google and the Android phones, according to this Fast Company Tech author. I will put the links to the stories that I talked about today over at my blog at Don't Let It Go if you guys want to check it out. Otherwise, I will let you go. Jennifer says, I don't want to listen to him. Well, luckily you don't have to listen to him. It would be even worse. Imagine if it was a robocall that he could force to you at any hour of the day or something. You'd have to actually listen to him. But still, I don't want to read a text from Donald Trump. Who wrote the amendment in New Hampshire? I have to find out more about it, Unshelled Coast asked, but we'll be hearing more about that as we get up to the November elections. I just think it's good that they singled out government, as I said. So thanks, everybody. I am out of here, and I hope you'll join me every Wednesday for this. Until next Wednesday, take care.